Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Disaster Preparedness, Are You Ready? This training is brought to you by Commercial Electronics. If you'd like to learn more about our recording solution, third-party quality assurance services, or Live 911, visit comelectronics.com. This webinar is part of our public safety education series, and you can view our upcoming webinars on our training page at comelectronics.com/training. I want to point out a couple of things before we begin. Many of the webinar functions are the same as those you may be used to from other programs, such as asking questions, seeing any polls that are launched, the chat, all by clicking on the icons on the left side of your screen. If there are any handouts associated with the webinar, which there are today, you will be able to access those by clicking on the handouts button. Everyone's automatically muted to eliminate background noise. However, if you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the microphone to raise your hand and request to be unmuted. You can also submit questions at any time by typing your questions into the Q&A pane or the chat pane of the control panel, and I'll address those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. One feature that I do want to point out is the notes button. You can take notes during the webinar, and those notes will be emailed to you automatically at the conclusion of the session. Now, keep in mind that you'll be the only one who'll be able to see your notes. At the end of the session, you'll have an opportunity to rate the session and give any comments. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. My name is Beth English, and I'm the trainer and QA program manager for Commercial Electronics. I started my career in public safety communications 33 years ago at the ripe old age of 9. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I've got my master's telecommunicator certification from Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. I'm a TCOL instructor and a past Texas NENA president. On the personal side, my husband and I spend our leisure time RVing with 2 dogs, 4 cats, and 2 hedgehogs, Weezer and Squeak. Many years ago, an 18-wheeler carrying liquid chicken fat wrecked during the morning rush hour at the intersection of 2 major highways in the Northeast. It spilled the chicken fat from the heated tanker into the roadway, where it seeped into all the grooves and the pores of the highway before it cooled and congealed. Doesn't that sound yummy? The highway was closed for several days while the state tried to clean it up. They used chemicals, they used sand, and they used high pressure water hoses. And they would think that they had it all cleaned up, and then they'd open the highway. But every time the sun came out and the road warmed up, the fat that had seeped into the cracks would melt, and it would come back up, making the road slick again. So it wasn't until Procter & Gamble sent a truck containing 3.5 tons of Dawn to the scene that they were finally able to get it cleaned up permanently. Now, afterwards, a spokesperson for Procter & Gamble was asked if they were going to use the incident in any advertising. They said that Dawn could advertise it by saying, "Get the fat out by the crack of dawn." That is still one of my favorite hazmat stories. And yes, you can plan for this, because believe it or not, if you Google fat spills, it's happened everywhere across the country. So today, our objectives are to name the 4 phases of emergency management. We're going to be able to list specific incidents to be evaluated for an emergency, list resources to analyze for emergency situations, state what hazards analysis consists of. We're going to state the difference between redundancy and diversity, We're going to list the 2 methods of making calls when phone systems are overwhelmed. And we're going to state other issues during emergencies to plan for that aren't immediately obvious. Now, before you can do a hazards analysis, you first need to know what it is. So the definition of a hazards analysis is the identification and study of any and all potential threats which might adversely affect the operations of a PSAP. The process requires a review of all potential hazards, internal, external, and possible targets. So with that in mind, we're going to look at what we need to analyze. Now, one thing I want to mention about today's lesson is that we will be covering items that are part of the E&P certification testing. So if you're planning on going for your E&P, pay attention and take notes because this may be on the test. Okay, when you start thinking about your emergency response plan, a truckload of chicken fat is probably not the first thing that comes to mind, but depending on where you are, you might want to add it to your list. Like I said earlier, the fat spills are quite common, and actually a lot of fire apparatus carry Dawn because it really does remove any kind of oily spill, but also because the bubbles actually suck the oxygen out around them. And so it's a good fire retardant. And just in case you need to know this, it's a good flea killer because you can wash your pets in Dawn. But no, what you think of for your emergency response plan are generally going to be the typical things that happen, such as equipment failures and natural disasters. So, I mean, that's really what normally happens, right? CAD goes down, 911 dies, or you have flooding, you have winter storms, hurricanes, etc. So let's start with the basics of what to do for planning. So first, we're going to start with the 4 stages of emergency management. The first one is mitigation, and mitigation is the activities that are designed to limit the impact of future disasters. Preparedness are the activities that are geared toward planning and preparing for a disaster, and you do that through pre-incident planning, disaster exercises, mutual aid agreements, etc. And this is where we're going to be focusing most of our attention today. Response is activities to provide the correct response, such as fire suppression, rescue, EMS, service restoration, whatever that may be. And then recovery, which is any activities that you take to restore service to the original level or better. Never worse. Okay, before you can develop your preparedness plan, you have to do a hazards analysis to determine what you need to plan for. And hazards analysis, like I said, is the identification of any and all potential threats that could adversely affect the operations of your PSAP. So this means doing a review of all the potential hazards. And so let's look at all those different hazards that you may have to look at. You know, we're all going to have natural hazards. We've had flood, hurricane, earthquake, tornado, ice storm, drought, volcano, forest fire, epidemic, and these are just the ones I can think of. You've also got your environmental or technical hazards. So that's going to be your hazardous material spill, your power outage, building collapse, a dam failure, or a transportation accident. And your transportation accident could be anything. It could be rail, it could be marine, aircraft, pipeline, any of those. Now, one thing that we've seen a lot of lately is the incited or the civil disorder. We've seen a lot of arson, riots, sabotage, vandalism. Terrorism is included in this list. Enemy attack, whether that's a conventional or a biological or a nuclear or a chemical. and then a hostage situation. And then you've got your man-made hazards, which is going to be like a cable cut or a backhoe fade, any kind of failure due to earth-moving equipment. So before we go on, I want to ask a question. We're going to do a poll. So what other hazards can you think of that haven't been mentioned? Anything that maybe you've experienced that I didn't mention here because it's not something you hear about that often. I'll give you a minute or so to answer. Just type in your answer and send it. Avalanche. Yeah, you know what? And I've been through an avalanche, so you're absolutely right. So we need to add that to the list. Windstorm. Oh, yes. Windstorm. And that's something that we've seen. I've not seen personally, but I know that in West Texas, they do have those windstorms, those really bad sandstorms, and a gas line cut. Very good. So y'all have definitely experienced some things. Okay, very good. So let's go on. Okay, there's other considerations that we need to look at in determining what hazards might impact your center as part of your hazards analysis. And so we need to look at geographic considerations. And by this, I mean thinking of anything near your PSAP that could adversely impact your center if something happened. So let's take a look at the different types of geographic considerations that might be in your area. You've got airports. I worked at one center that literally was on the other side of the fence from the airport. And so this was something that that we needed to pay attention to. You've got pipelines, refineries. This is something that gets hit every time a hurricane comes to Texas. Medical facilities, rivers, railroads, and highways. Okay, let's do another poll. Do you have anything else in your jurisdiction that might be a geographical hazard? Something that I haven't mentioned here. You know, one thing that I didn't mention is mountains. Dams, yes. Yes, very much so. Because we have seen that. I haven't personally, but we have seen that happen on the news. Okay, so mountains and dams would also. Multiple military bases. Yeah, very good. Okay, so we've got several here that that could be added. All righty then. Okay, so once you've determined all of the threats that could possibly exist, you need to do an impact evaluation so that you can schedule your planning accordingly, because you want to plan for those incidents that will have the most likely impact on your center. So these are questions to ask yourself. Does the hazard pose a threat to your area? Now, if your area is nowhere near the coast, then hurricanes are probably not a real threat to you. But if you live in a state that has a coastline And even though you may be several hundred miles from that coastline, you should consider moving hurricane planning up on the list. With the strength of some of the past hurricanes, many states have suffered damage hundreds of miles inland. And this is just one of the things that I know from experiencing that, because I'm not anywhere near the coast, but we did have damage from a hurricane. How often does it pose a threat? Is this something that occurs annually, like tornado season or hurricane season? Or is it something that you would probably never experience, such as an avalanche in Texas? And then what is the scope of the damage? If your agency was to experience a cable cut, would it completely isolate you from receiving any calls, or do you have a backup plan in place? And also, if you're in an urban area, will it affect the agency that you have as your backup? How many PSAPs would be lost to the cable cut? So you want to think about that. Is the hazard predictable? Okay, you have to look at this question in two ways. Everything listed previously is predictable. They may happen, they will happen, or they have happened. So you know you need to plan for them. But another way to look at this question is, will you have warning about the event? A lot of natural disasters are predictable in that you have warning. You know the bad weather's coming in. You know the hurricane is coming up to this particular coast. It's coming into the Gulf. It's going up the eastern coast. You have warnings about those. And we get notified of those. We get notified of severe weather. We get notified of ice storms that look like they're coming to the area. Now, not every disaster gives us warnings, but a good many of them do and can. And then what steps can be taken to mitigate that hazard? For instance, in the northern states, they know they're going to have snow. Every year, like clockwork, the snow starts in September, October, and it coats the roads. So they have snow plows to clear the road so that residents can get to where they need to be. That's mitigating the incident. They're prepared. They know it's going to happen. They know it's going to happen every year, and they're prepared for it. Whereas where I am in Texas, we don't have snow. And in fact, we barely have winter. So when we have an ice storm or a snowstorm or an actual winter, people tend to lose their minds. Nobody knows how to drive in storms. Half the people don't know how to drive in the rain, much less snowstorms. So a lot of this depends on where you are as to what steps you can take, because it doesn't make any sense for us to have snow plows for the winter storm that comes once every 42 years, but it would for all of the northern states. So once you've done your hazards analysis, you need to do a resource analysis. And by resources, I'm talking about what you need to keep your systems and your building up and running. So you need to do a resource analysis on your network. And that's going to include your central office, your tandems, whether it's your selective routers or your access tandems. You need to check on your network connectivity, whether that's the central office to the selective router, the tandem to the PSAP, or your wireless networks. And then your database, your alley links, or your database management system. Those are the things that you want to think about if you have redundancy for these systems, so that if something does happen, it doesn't take your PSAP down. You also want to look at your PSAP equipment. If you have an anti-alley controller, do a resource analysis on that. What's going to happen if that goes down? What about your workstations or your positions? How are your people going to work if those go down? We've had CAD systems for so long. I mean, even I started working with a CAD system. When I very first started 33 years ago, we had a CAD system. But we also used paper logs in addition to the CAD system. So going to paper wasn't that big of a deal. But with the Generation Z coming in now, do they even really know how to keep a written log? At this point, with everything on the computer, do any of us really remember how to write? So that's something that you want to make sure that you check into. What's going to happen if those go down? Are your people prepared for that? And how are they going to handle that? And then your CAD system. Do you have redundancy for your equipment? And this brings up another question. If you have redundancy, do you need diversity? And the answer is absolutely. If your system is redundant, but it's kept in the same room as the other system, then it's not redundant. If one goes, both go. So if your CAD server is in your equipment room, in your PSAP, and your backup server is in your equipment room, in your PSAP, you're not redundant. You need to have diversity. And by that, you need to have your equipment, maybe your CAD server in the computer room in your PSAP, but the backup server in maybe City Hall or one of the fire stations that's on the other side of town, or someplace where if your PSAP gets knocked out, your other system is still running because it wasn't touched. You also want to look at your infrastructure, which is your internal networks, and that's going to be your data, your voice, telecommunications, and your local network, your wide area network, and your metropolitan area networks. You want to look at your radio systems. Console failure, what happens then? What do you do? Your tower integrity and your connectivity issues. Will you still have connectivity? Your physical plant, which is your power. What happens if you lose your commercial power feed? Do you have a generator? If you have a generator or you don't have a generator, do you know what services need to be on the generator? Do you want your entire station to be on, your entire police station, fire station, whatever? Or do you want just communications to be on the generator? And that's going to determine the size of the generator that you need. If you're only going to put, 3 or 4 lines or whatever, then you don't need one that's going to support 150 employees. And then you want to look at the duration. How long do you want your generator to last? If you set it up for, let's say, 2 hours, but you've had a snowstorm like we did last year where everybody's out of power for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, the 2 hours isn't going to work. So, and then you want to look at your backup versus your surge protection. What do you have? Do you have a backup? Do you have surge protection? And then your testing and alarming, just to check into that. Your fuel capacity. You want to look at the fuel capacity and how your generator is going to be refueled, and then maintenance and testing. How do you keep up with the testing of your generator? What we did on our generator is we created a call sheet that popped up once a week at a certain time, and that reminded us that the generator was testing, and we would check to make sure that the generator was testing, and then we would make the notes in the call sheet and close it out. That way we had a record that it was being tested, and we knew if it wasn't working, then that was the time to check on it. So those are the things that you want to consider. And then you've got your, other issues. Your UPS. You've got different types of UPSs. Like some agencies have the UPS at each particular workstation. So you have a little UPS sitting there with your computer. You also may have a big UPS system in your equipment room. And that's another thing that you want to determine. What size do you want that to be? How long do you want that to run? You don't want the UPS to only run 15 minutes, because if your generator doesn't work, then in 15 minutes, you're dead in the water. So you want to make sure that you put that in and research that. And then again, you have to worry about testing and alarming and things like that. You've got heating and cooling and ventilation that you need to check on. One thing I will tell you is that at one place that I worked, when the EOC was built, they built the room for communications at the very back of the room. And it was basically a closet. But initially it wasn't built for communications. It was built as an equipment room until someone said, "Where's communications go?" And then they were like, "Oh, well, okay." So they put a wall up and they cut that closet in half. And one side held all the equipment. The other side was built for 2 people to sit in there. And the only thing about it was that when they put that wall up, it walled off the air coming into the room. So 2 people were supposed to sit in that room with no air vent, with the doors closed, taking calls during an emergency. So you really want to make sure that you've got heating and cooling and ventilation so that you don't have a room full of people passing out from no air. You need to worry about flooding. Is your building built in such a place that you don't have to worry about it flooding? Or are you in a flood area, but have you taken steps to mitigate that? You want to look at building distribution, you want to look at municipal distribution, and then of course, security. How secure is your facility? Do you have a way to keep unauthorized people out? And then you've got to look at your PSAP interruptions. And there is so much here that I could go over. This could be a whole nother session. So I'm going to refer you to the document that is attached to this session. Now, the one thing I do want to point out to you is the levels of service that you may have at the PSAP during an emergency or a disaster, and the levels that you need to plan for. So the first level of service is normal service. Okay, that means everything is operating as normal. Then you may have elemental service, and that's where you've got 1 or 2 services that are lost, and you've brought in your contingency operations. You also have minimal service, and that's where you have multiple systems that have failed, but the PSAP is still operating. And then you have total failure, where you've got to evacuate the center. So those are the 4 levels of service that you definitely need to plan for. So there are different incidents that you would need to plan for if your PSAP loses 911 service. You may have a PSAP equipment failure due to a cable cut, CPE equipment failure, or a network failure. So the PSAP may lose communications with the central office, or the PSAP has to be evacuated. But in each of these incidents, your calls would need to be rerouted either to an admin number at the PSAP or to another PSAP. So agreements with a backup agency and your 911 service provider need to be in place ahead of time. Now, something to consider when you're choosing a backup agency is the size of the agency. Are they about the same size center? And do they serve the same size area? If the backup center is significantly smaller than your center, they're not going to be able to handle the traffic of both centers, especially during an emergency. So your backup center needs to be similar size if it's going to if your calls are going to go to another PSAP. They need to be a similar size. If your equipment goes down, such as your 911 system or your CAD system, it is imperative that hard copy backups are available. You're going to need hard copies of your contact lists, your evacuation policies, and your SOPs. If you don't have CAD or you don't have your 911 system with all of your contacts in it, then you're going to have all of this on paper. Now, it helps if these are updated regularly so that the information is current at the time that you need it. If your SOP was written on scrolls and it's in ancient text, you probably need to make this a priority. And then for your electronic backups, you need to have any scheduled backups of servers, of CAD, or your CPE should be kept at an offsite storage facility, whether that's at another city building on the other side of town or at a neighboring agency. So, and this is a good idea, a chat that I've got here. We have a dispatch book for each station that has everything in it. We update them weekly. But if we ever need to leave, we just have to grab the book. And that's what our agency had, was the to-go books. And that's what we did. If we had to leave, we grabbed the to-go books and off we went. Okay. All personnel needs for PSAP personnel need to be considered in the contingency plan. And last winter was a perfect example of this. With the freeze, many people weren't able to get to their agencies and others weren't able to leave. So did those agencies have plans in place to provide them needed items such as snack food, water, sleeping areas, blankets, things like that? If it happened again today, would your agency be able to provide these things for you? It takes planning. It takes lots and lots of planning to have this. Okay, so far we've discussed making sure the incoming calls are answered. But what about the calls that need to go out? There are two services that allow calls to be placed in a priority status so that they'll go through the clogged networks in place of other non-emergency calls. The first one is the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, or GETS. And this service provides emergency access and priority processing in the local and long distance segments of the PSTN, or the Public Switch Telephone Network. It used to be that when the networks were congested, calls were not likely to complete. You got a message that said that it can't complete your call, or it may have said that the network was congested, or something to that effect. And even now, if something happens, just like last year, many people couldn't place calls because the network was so congested with people checking on other people or calling in, frozen streets, different things like that. So if you subscribe to GETS, you're assigned a PIN to access the service to place calls during an emergency or disaster. And then the other service is the Wireless Priority Service, or WPS. And this service provides a nationwide wireless capability to key personnel during an emergency or disaster. And there may be some minimal charges for this service, depending on how it's done. Key personnel generally are going to have agency phones or city or county phones assigned to them. So like your police chief, your sheriff, your fire chief, they're going to have phones assigned to them through the agency. So if that's how your agency operates, then when you register for this service, it's best to register the agency phone with the position rather than the name of the person who uses the phone. And this keeps you from having to change the records every time there's a personnel change in the position. And I learned this the hard way. So each of the city issued phones were registered by position, whether it was lieutenant, chief, assistant chief, PIO, whatever. All of those were registered with the position. So when the police chief left, that phone number went to the next police chief who came in, and he already had everything set up for that. So if you do this, let's say for like a volunteer fire department, you can register their personal phones, but you have to have an account number. Like if they're with AT&T, you have to have their AT&T account number to register, because like I said, there's a minimal charge. I want to say it was like $4.50 a month. And most of them were more than willing to pay that to be able to have access to the priority service. So I've got the web addresses on here for anyone that wants to check into this and look at it, so you can see this in the recording when you get it. And then you've got another service that's available, and it's for recovery. So the Telecommunications Service Priority, or TSP, is a federal program that allows an agency to sign up for priority installation and restoration of lines that are considered critical to emergency services. Now, you may think that because your lines are 911 lines and they're there strictly for emergencies, that those will be the first to be restored after an emergency, but that's not necessarily true. Unless you've registered your circuits with TSP, basically you'll be placed in the queue behind other customers to be restored with no ETA on having your agency back up and running. So you may be behind the hospitals, you may be behind schools, some businesses. So you really want to make sure that you register your circuits, your 911 circuits, maybe your admin circuits, your make busy circuit, things like that. You want to make sure that you register those so that those are going to be a priority to be restored if they go down. So there's an application process that you go through where you designate the lines that meet the national security and emergency preparedness requirements. And this is something that you'll find on this website. And so what the FCC does is they give you a code for each of those lines, and then you provide those codes to your service provider, who then completes the process of getting those registered. Now, there's a minimal enrollment fee per line. I want to say it's maybe $100. And then there's a monthly fee of about $3 per line. And that may be more or less depending on where you are and your communications company. So now what we've talked about so far are just a few of the challenges that you need to plan for. And they all revolve around keeping your center up and running, or figuring out where your calls need to go during an emergency. So I have another poll that I want to ask. And I want to know, what other challenges have you faced during an emergency that you had not planned for? And if there's something you haven't planned for, don't feel bad, because I can tell you right now, there's so much stuff that I've learned the hard way. I'm just glad I can share some of what I've learned. Okay, I'll give y'all just a few more seconds to answer. Okay. Well, yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, 33 years and I've only seen full staffing one time in that amount of time. So short staffing has always been a huge, huge issue for us. But the responders not being trained. So this just brings up something else that I'd like to mention. When the fire department goes out on a call, regardless of what kind of call it is, they practice ICS, Incident Command System, on every single call they go out on, so that when we have the big calls, they know what to do. They know how to manage it. One person calls the shots. Everybody reports to that one person reports to us, and it works. The thing is, law enforcement doesn't generally do that. Now, I was fortunate to work for an agency many years ago that did do that. The police department actually started doing ICS on every call so that they would be ready for when the big call happened. Now, I can tell you that before that happened, we did have some big calls, and it sounded like Keystone Cops on the radio. I mean, it was embarrassing. And so one of the things that I like to encourage agencies to do is to get their law enforcement to start practicing ICS. Everybody has to take the ICS lessons. Police, fire, communications, everybody has to do ICS or the FEMA classes. So it's something that everybody should be familiar with. And, and I've been, hauled on the carpet before because we had a major call and we didn't hear one officer on one channel say something, and it didn't get relayed to the lieutenant on the other channel, and so they said, we should have been monitoring that channel. Well, not like we didn't have anything else to do in the room. I mean, I was filing my nails. I don't know what everybody else is doing, but the thing is, they should have been doing their ICS. They should have had one person that they're reporting to and then handing that information down to the next people. And they didn't do it. And, they tried calling me on the carpet for it. And I said, no, you've been to the FEMA sessions. You know what to do. You didn't do it. You can't blame this on me. Y'all messed up. And so literally, if all the agencies did ICS on every call, they would be ready for this. So yes, that can be a huge, huge challenge when you've got major calls going on. Okay, so one radio issue to consider is the perfect storm. Now, a lot of, if not most agencies, are moving to the P25 radio systems that have redundancy built into the redundancy. And one of the assumptions of these new systems is that they will never go down, but it can happen. You cannot rely on any system to remain 100% functioning, no matter how many promises are made or how many levels of redundancy are built in. And I can tell you that from not personal experience, but I was told about this new radio system that went down. So what will you do when your radio goes down completely? Do you have backup radios, whether they're VHF, UHF, or a backup other radio system? And if you have backup radios, do your employees know where they are? Are they built into your consoles now, or are they separate radios sitting in chargers? And most importantly, how often do your employees practice using them? So having backup radios is only great if everyone knows they're there and remembers how to use them. And this was one of the difficulties that one agency had, is that they had not had to use their backup radios in so long, they didn't even remember that they were there. So they literally sat there dead in the water, even though they didn't have to be. So If your backup radios just sit there year after year forgotten, then they aren't really a backup, are they? So a plan is only a plan if it can be implemented. So you want to make sure that everybody practices using those radios. Another issue to consider is when you have multiple agencies responding to your area for a disaster or other critical incident. So with the new radio systems and the ability for multiple agencies to work on shared talk groups, a plan needs to be in place for handling those various agencies on the radio. So things to consider: will those agencies need to be patched together? And if so, who's going to do the patching? Which agency? Are all of those agencies using plain English, or are some of them still stuck on codes and signals? Is the numbering unit the same? The unit numbering system. During one critical incident that we had 5 agencies on our radio frequency, and each agency had a unit 101 working that day. So if the dispatcher called 101 on the radio, everyone answered. And it got worse when 101 called 101 on the radio. I'm telling you, that was a mess. So it's best when multiple agencies are on one frequency to have units use their agency names in addition to their numbers. So like Dallas 101 to Rockwall 101, or, however. It's, believe me, it makes it so much easier to keep up with them that way. And then you also want to consider the terrain in your area. Do you have dead zones where radio traffic can't reach? And if so, have you considered partnering with your local ham radio group? They can be a valuable resource to any agency in times of disaster. So if you're in a mountainous region and you have areas that even your new P25 radio can't reach because of the shadows from the mountain, ham radios are really the best way to get around that, because, line of sight, they can all talk. So consider having that available to you. And then another challenge, oddly enough, are the donations that come in during an emergency. So citizens who aren't affected by the incident, bless their hearts, they start calling the communications center to ask where they can deliver donations. And so what happens is we end up with hundreds, even thousands of items to be distributed to the victims. And included in the donations are always many items that are unusable and just need to be discarded. There may be old clothes, torn shoes, used underwear. I mean, we've seen everything come in. And this becomes another task for those who are in charge of an incident to worry about, while at the same time trying to recover from the incident. And the calls start coming in to your communication center. People want to know, where can I drop off donations? And you don't have time to answer those questions. Now, churches and other organizations will step up to help with the logistics of donations, but it can take some time to determine who and where those receiving centers are going to be. In the meantime, you're getting overwhelmed with the initial flood of donated items coming into your building. So it's best to anticipate that this is going to happen and have a process in place in advance of an emergency. That way, you're not scrambling to find someone who can be dedicated to handling the intake of the donations until such time as a process can be established. Have it already established, and then that way, when it starts happening, you've got somebody to put in charge of it and let somebody else worry about it. Another challenge that's often underestimated is the absolute sheer number of volunteers who arrive to assist in search and rescue. So not only are you going to have sworn officers and firefighters and public works personnel from other agencies responding, but citizens will rally to help each other and the responders in the best way they know how. And if you haven't planned for this, it's going to add more chaos to what you already have, because somebody has to handle the volunteers, whether they're sworn or civilian. So a plan needs to be in place with specific personnel assigned to each group for when those volunteers start calling or showing up immediately after the incident, wanting to know where to respond. There need to be separate designated areas for police volunteers from other agencies, fire volunteers from other agencies. You may have public works volunteers coming from other agencies, and then the civilian volunteers. So they each need to have a separate place to report, maybe have some maps printed and some other resources available for those who aren't familiar with the area. So basically, you want to make sure that they have the tools that they need to do their jobs. And then having this in place will save everyone from additional headaches, and it'll keep the volunteers from going into places they shouldn't be and possibly getting hurt. Now, keep in mind that depending on the type of incident, you may have these volunteers and extra personnel on hand for weeks or even months after the incident. So as the weeks go on and sworn volunteers continue to report for duty, you want to make sure that you have a place for them to report to that doesn't interfere with your communications center. If every time they report to your department, someone from communications has to let them into the locked areas of the building, that's putting an undue burden on the communications personnel. So make sure that the sworn volunteers either have temporary card keys or designated escorts to get into areas that they're expected to access. In each critical incident that has been reported, one constant has been the looters. You've seen it on the news, raiding the stores and other businesses, setting fires, assaulting people. Critical incidents are considered a perfect time by the looters due to responders either being overwhelmed with search and recovery, performing life-saving measures, trying to restore law and order, or, in some cases, there aren't any law enforcement. It's just a free-for-all. So the looting just becomes another issue that you're going to get calls about, and they're going to get calls about whether they're able to do anything or not. Now, during one disaster in our area, a bunch of citizens got together and formed a group that they called the Looter Booters in order to combat the looters. And their mission was to patrol all the damaged areas and to report any looters they came across. But then we also started getting calls from them reporting members of their group being attacked or harassed by the looters. And as we've already seen, those confrontations can and will end badly for someone. Our agency appointed someone to be the looter booters point of contact to coordinate their patrol times and locations, but also to school them on things to do and things not to do. So having a person assigned to handle any vigilantes would be a good idea, just in case that's something that you have to worry about. Now, during a critical incident, while you're focusing on rescue and recovery, it's easy to forget about the animals or never even think about them. So one thing to keep in mind is that you cannot forget about the animals. That's just the way it is. During an incident, whether it's natural or man-made, animals are going to be displaced, and not all of them are going to be pets. There are going to be some wild animals. Depending on your area, you may have foxes, you may have wild hogs. I mean, there's all kinds of things out there. Some animals may be carried to other parts of the city by severe weather, such as a tornado or a hurricane, and others may take off running, scared away from their homes by a storm or a loud noise. In these cases, you're going to have calls coming in from citizens who've lost their pets and calls from people who have found animals. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't normally happen in the middle of the day when the animal shelter is open. Normally, these storms are going to happen in the late evening or middle of the night when animal control is off duty, veterinarian offices are closed, and you have no recourse for dealing with the animals. Now, this is something that you can and should plan for in advance by including animal control, veterinarians, and animal rescue and rehab groups in your emergency operations plan. You need to have it detailed in your plan. Who's going to be called, by whom, and when will they be called? And having these contacts in place will take a huge burden off your center when you have a critical incident, as well as solving something that can end up being a big problem for your agency. And although it seems like such a small thing to worry about in the wake of a disaster, there are a lot of people that are much more worried about their pets than their families. So it would be a good idea to make sure that you have provisions for this in advance. Now, let's talk about some post-incident tasks. Just because a critical incident has passed, it doesn't mean that it's over. Recovery can last for months or even years after the actual incident, as any coastal area can tell you. In the case of a natural disaster, cities and/or counties will try to recover unbudgeted expenses incurred during the disaster and recovery from FEMA. In order to do this, certain procedures have to be followed and the appropriate paperwork has to be filed. Now, it's essential that you have someone to coordinate that paperwork, checking to ensure that it's all completed correctly and submitted according to FEMA guidelines. The paperwork to be submitted includes documentation of all the hours that are worked in relation to the incident by all employees. And that means those from other agencies, those from your agency, any other police, fire, public works, anybody that comes in to help. And any expenses incurred for purchases towards cleanup or reconstruction. So this is an extremely important task because if the paperwork is not completed exactly as instructed by FEMA, you run the risk of having any reimbursement denied. And I can tell you from personal experience, the amount of money that your city or county will pay for post-incident cleanup and reconstruction runs into the millions. And some of that money may come from funds that were budgeted for raises or other employee benefits. So, sorry about that. So having one person or one small group in charge of doing this paperwork is what you want to do, because I can tell you right now, every single person is going to receive the exact same instructions for completing the forms, and every single person is going to turn it in done differently. And that's why you want to make sure that you have someone to check on this. You also want to make sure that you have copies of radio traffic during the incident, especially if the incident may be something that's involving a shooting, a line of duty death, an act of terrorism, or some other man-made disaster. Copies of radio traffic and 911 calls need to be made as soon as possible in order to keep from losing any of them due to retention periods. You want to utilize your employee assistance programs, especially if the incident involved the death or injury of a responder or a communications officer. Often the stress of an incident will adversely affect employees, even if no injuries were reported. In the event of disaster, such as a flood or a hurricane or tornado or a mudslide, for instance, the continued stress for days or weeks at a time will wear on employees to the point that they're no longer effective in their position. So it's imperative that the employer provide assistance to them in the aftermath. And some employees won't even know that they need help until it's provided to them. And then after any type of critical incident, you need to do a quality assurance check. Many employees will get so overwhelmed with the incident that they'll throw caution to the wind and resort to actually saying what they want to say, not what they should say, but what they want to say. And we all know that that never ends well. So a certain amount of customer service skills can and will go out the window, but a critical incident does not give license to disregard all customer service training. So take the time to QA some calls to review with your team later. And remember, QA doesn't always have to be bad. You can find outstanding examples of service in the midst of a disaster, and you would want to recognize those employees. Okay, so for solutions, let's recap what solutions you can have in place to make these disasters or critical incidents go as smoothly as possible. Okay, have a radio plan in place. Know in advance what units will be on which talk groups. If talk groups are patched, determine who's going to do the patching and when. Use agency names with unit numbers. If you have a backup plan in place, practice using it so when they need it, they know what to do. And then consider partnering with your local amateur radio groups. They can be a huge resource during a disaster. You want to be prepared to have someone available to handle the multitude of donations that start coming in immediately after the incident. And it doesn't have to be someone from the agency. Like I said, when you're doing your plan, work with the other groups, other agencies, churches, all kinds of different groups will work with you and be available for your plan. Be prepared for your vigilantes getting in the way and causing more mischief. So have a plan in place for dealing with them. Don't forget about the animals. Make arrangements with veterinarians, the animal shelter, and various rescue and rehab groups to respond as soon as possible after the incident to take care of the animals, whether they're domestic or wild. Bring them in when you're doing your plan and have them part of that planning session. And then consider having one person designated to coordinate the FEMA paperwork to ensure that it's done correctly for reimbursement. Because remember, small mistakes in the paperwork can cause rejection of your reimbursement claim. And then get copies of radio traffic and calls as soon as possible before their retention period expires. You want to take care of your caregivers. Use the EAP program. Don't assume everyone is fine after going through such a stressful time. Do quality assurance checks on calls and radio traffic and recognize those who did outstanding work. But not just them, recognize everyone who helped during that time. Now, before we get to the questions, I want to remind you to tune in next month. Same bat time, same bat channel, Wednesday, February 2nd at noon Central Time for our next webinar, which is actually going to be a roundtable discussion, navigating career changes in 911. And we will be discussing the various options open to those who want to move forward in their careers and keep it in 911. We're going to have 3 guest speakers, Tony Dunn with Motorola Solutions, Mary Boyd with Intrado, and Lisa Dodson with Motorola Solutions. So if you, as I've heard many times before, don't want to be a dispatcher all your life, join us to see what opportunities are available to you that you can plan for. So now, if you have any questions, go ahead and send those in. Put those in the question or the chat box, and I'll get those answered. And while I'm waiting for questions, I just want to remind you that if you need a certificate for today's lesson for CEUs, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. And I want to thank you for joining us. This presentation has been made possible by Commercial Electronics, provider of public safety solutions, including Higher Ground NG 911 recording, Live 911, which is pretty darn cool, and CQIP third-party quality assurance program. So I will sit here and wait for questions to come in. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, then thank you for joining us. Have a great day. And like I said, just send those emails in if you want a certificate for attending the training. Thank y'all.